Harvey Webster. Harvey and I go back some 30 years. And if you haven't been to the Museum of Natural History, you've got to go. If you're interested at all in anything in the natural world, from the core, molten core of the Earth, to the stars a million light years away, and everything in between is represented there. And Harvey is Director of Wildlife Resources there. He got that nice write-up in the Plain Dealer. I also would be remiss if I didn't note that when my daughter was 12 years old, Harvey took her under his wing in the Future Sciences program and had her out pulling weeds and banding birds and doing various things every week for years and years and years. I take credit for the fact that she is now a professor of wildlife pathology at Cornell. I give him credit for talking her into going to Cornell because it's his alma mater and it cost me my life savings. Harvey has put together the Perkins Wildlife section over the years there at the museum, and it is a phenomenal place, and it is about to be uprooted and moved. But if you can get there right away, you ought to, because he's gone from barren closures to real habitats where bobcat jump from limb to limb, where otters swim in the water through a plexiglass see-through pool. Sandhill Cranes are newest ad.
They were scolding me as I left the museum.
So without further ado, you, Harvey, and thank you very much for making time in your schedule, because I know you're heading up the attempt to raise money for all these projects. And,
Okay. I would like to do this without this. Can I do that? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Cool. Okay, let's do that. Okay, it is a great pleasure to be with you today. You know, it's interesting. Ed was talking about the Museum of Natural History and all the cool things that we have there. We're exploring a whole concept. As a matter of fact, it's fundamental to what we're trying to do in renovating our museum. A little modest $150 million renovation. But what we want the museum to be is very relevant to what we're here about today, what we're talking about. That is, we want the Museum of Natural History to be a trailhead. We want folks to come to the Museum of Natural History, learn about all of the fabulous things about this planet we live on. Unique, as far as we know, the only place where life is found in the universe. Dynamic in the fact that life has shaped the planet. Yet inhale, go ahead and 20% oxygen. Well, thank all those cyanobacteria and all of those blue-green algae and all those other plants over eons that have contributed the 20% oxygen to the atmosphere, because it didn't get there by itself. Actually, life has transformed this planet, and it's given us an exquisite diversity of life that we see here today. And, of course, our parks, our natural areas, our preserves are what capture the best of our natural heritage. So we really believe very strongly in that word conservation. The idea that, you know, yes, we want to move forward, we want to have a healthy standard of living, but we also want to make sure that all of the other things that make up our natural heritage are not left behind. And that's sort of the story, the essence of this story about the bald eagle. Because the bald eagle is talk about an icon, it is the national bird. Whenever you see the President of the United States, there's the Great Seal of the United States of America, and there's the bald eagle on it. 1782, the Congressional Congress voted on adopting the bald eagle as our national symbol. And yet, you'd think that we would celebrate a bird like that? It didn't actually get any kind of protection at all from any governmental agency until 1940. Got its own act of Congress. And up to that point, it had been open season on bald eagles. Bald eagle numbers had kind of lingered on, but in the modern era post-World War II, there was a whole bunch of other assaults that came to them. This is a story about the bald eagle in Ohio, and the things that pushed it towards the edge of extirpation, regional extinction, and the effort that went into bringing it back. And nowadays, I'm happy to say, you go through your Geauga parks, you go up by Bass Lake, and man, you see bald eagles. There's bald eagles over by Snow Lake. There's bald eagles at Ladue. There's bald eagles all over the place. But back in 1979, there were only 4 active nests in the entire state. Okay, so what are we talking about? We are talking about this guy. So this is the national bird. Striking in appearance, orange-yellow bill, straw-yellow eye, white head, white tail, deep brown body. It is as striking as you can imagine a bird to be. And it is uniquely American. It has a distribution from Florida to Alaska. You don't find it in Siberia. You don't find it in Africa or Asia. There are other sea eagles. But this bird, this species, Hyliaeus leucocephalus, occurs only in North America. It truly is ours. And it belongs to this group we call it. You can't see. Do you want to get in over here someplace where you can see it? Okay, good. We call them sea eagles. So if you compare this to a golden eagle, you would notice that they've got a much taller beak, an incredibly robust beak, really powerful, like all the birds of prey, powerful feet, and they are wonderfully designed for capturing fish. And they can do so elegantly. They could be up on a tree overlooking Ladue Reservoir, see a bass come to the surface of the water, just leave some ripples. They glide down, coming low to the surface of the water, and pass over that spot, reach down, and just pull that thing clean and jerk it right out of the water, carry it off to their nest and feed it to the young. They also eat lots of other things. This is hard for you to see, but this is a picture from a nest cam. And in this nest, there happens to be a big muskrat right there. So they'll eat mammals, not just fish. And if you notice what this guy's eating, it's eating a Canada goose. One of the few natural enemies of Canada geese, at least avian or bird enemies, are bald eagles. And if you ever go to Ladue or Pymatuning or Mosquito Creek Reservoir or the big reservoirs in winter, if there's any open water, oftentimes there's hundreds, if not thousands, of geese that are gathered there. And oftentimes on the ice, you'll see stationed about 30, 40 yards apart, bald eagles. And they're just watching, looking for sign of weakness. Because the national bird is very opportunistic. Okay? And they build these colossal nests, giant nests, that sometimes, well, I'll tell you about a nest that was truly great. And you can see that when they're young in the nest, they're all dark, that sort of chocolate brown down. In their first year, oftentimes they're all dark. They'll have white in the base of the tail and white in the wing linings. And it takes them 5 years to get the white head and the white tail that's typical. And as I said, it's the national bird. There's the Great Seal of the United States of America. 20th of June, 1782 is when the bird was adopted. Supposedly, at the time, Benjamin Franklin objected. Because he said the bald eagle is a bird of bad moral character. Now, wait a minute. Who's passing judgment on bald eagles? Well, it turns out that bald eagles are very clever. And I said they're opportunistic. So let's say an osprey or fish hawk has just grabbed a fish. And ospreys, and we have ospreys that nest in Geauga County, they pick up that fish, and the first thing they do is they shuffle their feathers and get rid of the water, and then they take the fish and they turn it so the head faces in the same direction as the head of the osprey, so it's aerodynamic and doesn't drag them on. So they fly elegantly off with their fish, only coming over their shoulders is a bald eagle diving down on them. The osprey says, oh my gosh, it drops the fish, turns around to face the eagle with its talons. The eagle goes right past it, grabs the fish, and flies off. And, you know, that to Ben Franklin was an act of piracy. Okay? So, fortunately, he was overruled, though, because his choice would have been the wild turkey. You know? I don't know that the wild turkey would have looked, don't get me wrong, it's a noble bird, but I'm not sure it's quite as cool as this. Now, you know, they're storied in terms of, when you take a look at the great works of John James Audubon, and you see these amazing paintings that he and Alexander Wilson and the pioneering naturalists of the late 1700s and early 1800s, they capture our imagination. They usually have bloody scenes where the bird of prey is, you know, reducing its prey into bite-sized pieces. But it was also closely tied to wetlands. So think about the shore of Lake Erie. Think about the natural estuaries that you have, like Arcola Creek, or this is Old Woman's Creek. Think of any place where you have pristine wetlands. And I showed this picture up here, because this is a picture that was taken at a place called Winus Point. It's on the far west end of Sandusky Bay in Lake Erie. So if you've ever went to Cedar Point and you were at the top of any one of those rides and you looked due west, you wouldn't be able to see it, but where the bay comes down to the Sandusky River, that's where Winus Point is. There was a time when Winus Point had a great blue heron rookery. Okay, you guys have a rookery park here with great blue herons in Geauga County. That rookery at one time had 1,200 nests. Now if we think there's a mom and a dad and one or two youngsters per nest, you're talking about a thriving heron metropolis in excess of 4,000 birds. And that was tribute and testimony to the incredible productivity of our Lake Erie, and particularly Sandusky Bay. All of the fish and the frogs and the tadpoles and all of the other things that you could concentrate so many birds in one place and have them be successful there. So this was the world of bald eagles. If you talk about some of our pioneering naturalists here in Ohio, Jared Potter Kirtland, this guy who we think of sort of one of the founders of modern natural history in the state of Ohio, he moved here. If you've ever been up to Kirtland, Ohio, in Lake County is named for Turhan Kirtland, his father, who actually was an agent with the Connecticut Land Company and was an investor there. He also had land in Poland, Ohio, by Youngstown. Kirtland Hills, Ohio, says that it's named in honor of the son of the famed naturalist and physician, Jared Potter Kirtland. And he had a farm out in what is called Rockport then, we call it Lakewood now. But there, at the mouth of the Rocky River, there was an active bald eagle nest, and he talked about it in his journals from 1845 to 1858. So the bald eagles were all over the place, and they caught the attention of this guy. This guy's one of my heroes. This is Francis Hobart Herrick. You know, no one ever heard of this guy, but he was a professor of biology at Western Reserve College, now Case Western Reserve University. And he was a real Renaissance man in the natural sciences. He wrote the first monograph about the natural history of the American lobster when he was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. He wrote on lots of other freshwater organisms. He was John James Audubon's first biographer after his granddaughter. And then he also was fascinated with the life history of birds. Like, you know, what happens in the nest of a bird? We have that same fascination. If you have a pair of robins that are nesting in a shrub in your backyard, and you're captivated by watching them as they carefully build the nest using grapevine and using mud and other things, and they've got a wonderful nest bowl, and there's that blessed day when the female lays her first egg, and then another egg, and perhaps a clutch of 4 or 5 eggs, and then they dutifully incubate those eggs, sometimes under very harsh conditions, with the female keeping those eggs warm, maybe 99 degrees, 100 degrees, no matter what the outside temperature is, until finally those eggs hatch, and you see the tiny little babies, and they raise them. We're all fascinated with that. Well, he wanted to figure out how you could capture that on film in the early part of the 1900s, when cameras were like this big. And he was coming back from a visit to New England, and he was on a train going through northwestern Pennsylvania, and he saw this giant nest on a lone tree in a field, a bald eagle nest, and he thought to himself, what would it take to be able to get up on the same level and get pictures of the bald eagles in their nest? So he basically invented what we would now call blind photography. That is, creating a blind or a hide, where you're getting in there with your camera so you can take pictures and gain the confidence. The idea is that, you know, day after day, since the birds are seeing the blind, they forget about it. It's part of the woodwork. And they don't really care what's happening inside the blind, so you can capture images of what's going on there. So he did that. This was his first blind right there. This is by the great nest I'm about to show you. And then he added a second level to it. And there's his Army issue tent up there, canvas tent. And this is the nest he photographed. This is the great nest of Vermilion, Ohio. This nest, according to reports, was first started in 1890. And they built a layer here. Now what eagles oftentimes do is the following spring they like to come back to the same nest and they add another layer. So it's this big, this big, and this big, and this big, and this big. Over the next, well, let's see, 1890 to 1925. That nest grew in proportion until ultimately it was 12 feet tall, 8 feet across the top, and weighed 2½ tons. It was a tribute to the shellbark hickory it was able to actually support that nest for as long as it did, because finally the whole thing came crashing down. It's interesting to point out that even though historically eagles were oftentimes associated with wild, pristine wilderness areas, what do you see behind you? Fields. These are farms near Lake Erie shoreline, but they're on the background. They're on fence rows of farms. The Ohio birds showed an incredible tolerance for human activity, and that was going to be key ultimately to their survival. I had a guy by the name of Charles Shipman, who was a, if you've ever heard of the Burroughs Nature Club that meets up in Willoughby, Ohio, Charles Shipman was its president for, I think, the better part of 25 years. And if you ever knew the Pallisters, who was Greta Pallister, Charles Shipman was Greta Pallister's father, and he was a retired chemist, and he got drafted by Dr. Herrick to actually be the guy up in the blind, and he took pictures like this. Now, I'll probably get over here and get out of your way. Now you might notice that that's a color picture. That's a color picture from 1925. You might say, wait a minute, they didn't have color photography back then. What they would do with these pictures is they would take their black and white photo, they would apply it, or develop it on a glass slide, a lantern slide, and then using Japanese watercolors. I don't know why, it was always these Japanese watercolors, they would hand paint the images and give them the color that you see here. Now that great nest fell down, so it was followed by this nest, and look at the tower they built, or what they call the Eagle Observatory. This amazing structure in scaffold and steel so they can get up to that level and take pictures like this. I mean, here is an adult bald eagle. I don't know how well you can see, but that is the head of about a 2-week-old baby. This is being done in the 1920s. Unbelievable perseverance and just a great thing. Herrick wrote a book called The American Eagle. It is actually the pioneering monograph about the American bald eagle. Both its natural history and also its symbolism and heraldry and how important it is to so many folks around here, to Native American organizations. The United States of America is our symbol. So fabulous pictures. Here's another one from a more modern nest. Here's the adult coming in and 2 youngsters that are in the nest bowl. Just fabulous stuff, and these were some of the hazards they had to encounter to get out to their nest observatory. So fascinating stuff, and I tell you that because Ohio was very much eagle country, particularly the Lake Erie shoreline, the marshes of western Lake Erie, and then a lot of the big rivers or big marshes. This would be naturally attractive to bald eagles, and bald eagles were found throughout this region. But something happened. The first thing that happened to them is persecution. Now, I told you that it wasn't until 1940 that the bald eagle actually got total federal protection. Congress passed the Bald Eagle Act, which made it illegal to kill or possess bald eagles. Well, I have bald eagles at the museum, but I don't own them. You do. They belong to the United States of America. We have a permit from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, the Ohio Division of Wildlife. We hold them. We use them in education. We exhibit them. But they're not anybody's property other than that. And you know what I do with the feathers? Because once a year those birds are going to molt their feathers and grow a new set. I collect them all up, I put them in a box, they're shipped out to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service National Eagle Feather Repository outside of Denver, Colorado. And if Native Americans who have a strong religious reason to need eagle feathers for their ceremonial wear, they can petition the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If they can demonstrate their claim, they can get these feathers that were cast by animals kept in captivity. No bird gets harmed in the wild. So it's actually a pretty good thing. But this idea about persecution, a lot of people in the 1800s, the only good predator was a dead predator. And that was a pervasive view, and that wasn't, the some folks that were shady down the road or something like that. That was the government telling you that predators are bad. We offer a bounty on them. You go out and shoot. In Alaska, from 1900 to 1940 or so, if you showed up at a state game office with a pair of bald eagle feet, they would pay you for them. And over 100,000 bald eagles were killed in that period of time. And bounty paid on them. Now, the reason? Salmon fishing. You have this extraordinary resource of the salmon in Alaska. Eagles eat salmon. Therefore, the logic was, eagles must be bad for salmon. But you probably know that salmon, when they're spawning, they get to their spawning grounds, they spawn, and then what do? They die. That's what these guys are eating. They're eating the dead and dying salmon. They have no impact upon the fishery whatsoever. So over 100,000 bald eagles slaughtered for no reason. So it's taken us a long time to understand the relevance and the importance of predators. And just as an aside, I'll tell you a great story. Very controversial, but a couple decades ago, they decided to try and reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone National Park. Now, Yellowstone had been without wolves for the better part of 75 years. And because there were no wolves, there was nothing to hunt the elk. Like nothing to hunt the deer around here. I won't get into that. But anyway, so the elk grew in numbers, and they could eat wherever they wanted to eat with impunity. And they like to come out to the streams, and they like to eat all the aspen and all the willow. They would denude the banks, and they would increase soil erosion. There was nothing for the beavers to eat, so the beavers weren't making their dams. They weren't retarding that soil erosion. There was less place for the bears to go look for food. There was less habitat for all of the birds to nest. When they brought wolves in, the wolves start hunting the elk. Now the elk can't wander out of the forest with impunity. They have to stay in the shadow of the forest and come out at night and eat near the edge of the forest. They don't get down by the stream. So guess what? The willows and the aspen come back, the beaver come back, and they create this habitat which stabilizes the shoreline and actually changes the course of the rivers and streams in Yellowstone. We call it a trophic cascade, and it turns out the predator, the wolf, was key to the health of the ecosystem. These are things that we're just learning in the last 10, 20 years. This is really, really new stuff, and it's big, big picture ecology. How have all these parts work together? We know that deer came back in Ohio. And when I say came back, 1906 was an interesting year, because the last white-tailed deer was killed in Ohio around 1906. And we were absolutely deer-less. In all 88 counties in the state for the better part of 25 years, the ancestor of the Ohio Division of Wildlife imported deer from neighboring states. And between those that were released, as well as animals coming in from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, we now have 750,000 deer in the state of Ohio. A population that if you were a Native American 500 years ago, you would have died to have that many deer around. So you get a sense that things might be slightly out of balance. Anyway, persecution took a huge toll. There were ranchers out in the west that used to make great sport of shooting bald eagles from fixed-wing or rotary aircraft. Because, again, they were using the excuse that they thought these guys were killing their livestock. They might scavenge the livestock, but they're not killing anything. So we've had a rather tortured relationship with our big predators. Another thing that contributed to decline of bald eagles was the fact that when we started taking a look at this landscape and we're settling Ohio, there was 1,500 square miles of wetland called the Black Swamp in northwestern Ohio. Now, this is part of an ancestor of Lake Erie, incredibly fertile soils. And it was a challenge when you found a wetland to drain it and to turn it into useful, arable property. So we were I won't say waging war, we were just transforming the landscape, getting rid of the wetlands, channelizing, using drain tile, and creating areas that we could make for our crops. And nothing wrong with that. When we're settling Ohio, people are trying to make a go, but the net effect over since Ohio became a state is about 90% of our wetlands have been destroyed. So if you think about if eagles needed wetlands, you've just eliminated 90% of the potential habitat that they might use. So we were pressuring them by persecution, we were pressuring them in habitat destruction, You know, nowadays you can see we like to live along the lake. Well, so do eagles. So we're in active competition, actually, for the eagles. And the farther they have to nest away from the lake, the more difficult it is for them to provision their youngsters, and the further the youngsters might have to go to actually access food. But in spite of all those things, eagles persisted. They persisted up until the Second World War. Areas where you found them, though, as their numbers were starting to decline in the 50s and 60s, and people weren't quite sure why, instead of being all across the United States, as they once were, they were confined to these areas: Florida, Chesapeake Bay, Great Lakes, and you can see there were two populations, one close to us, straddling the Pennsylvania border in the Western Basin, the Yellowstone ecosystem, Pacific Northwest. But they were in an incredible state of decline, where there were fewer than 1,000 nests in the entire lower 48. Even when they were highly endangered here, I must tell you though, there were always healthy populations in Canada and in Alaska. One other thing that contributed to them that we found out was that they are susceptible to lead poisoning. And here's a thing, and this is no slam against duck hunters, because duck hunters are some of the finest conservationists you're going to find out there. Ducks Unlimited has raised money to secure more breeding habitat for waterfowl than just about any other agency. They do a fabulous job. But when we used to use lead shot shooting over water, it had two effects. If the lead shot, any lead pellets that didn't hit their mark would settle down in the water, as it settled down into the shallows, as ducks tip up and they would feed on the pellets, and they'd ingest the pellets, and they would suffer from lead poisoning. Okay? Or let's say you wing cripple the duck, like this handsome canvasback here, and it can't fly, but other than that, it's swimming around able to feed itself. Well, remember I told you about the bald eagle is an opportunist, so if it sees something that thinks that it's injured or crippled, that's the bird it's going to go for. Either one, if it's got lead pellets in its flesh or lead pellets in its stomach, the eagle eats it, then the eagle becomes subject to lead poisoning. And one of the reasons why you cannot shoot lead pellets over water anywhere is because of the effect it was having on the bald eagle when the bald eagle was an endangered species. So the real thing that was sort of the nail in the coffin, if you will, was pesticides. PCBs, heavy metal, lead, mercury, all these things, because up until the Clean Water Act, we just dumped anything in the water. It's so famous as to be sort of trite, but the fact that the Cuyahoga River, it didn't burn once. It burned constantly ever since J.D. Rockefeller built his refineries there. It would burn from time to time because there was this thick, oily layer sitting on top of the water that was in fact flammable. So we tended to regard our rivers as a place to dump our stuff because it goes downstream and it's no longer our concern. And so it turns out there was one compound in particular, DDT. Now this was a revolution from the Second World War. This was an insecticide, a pesticide, a biocide. It was something that seemed to kill insects, but didn't seem to harm us. And so the thought was, man, this is great. We can use this for all sorts of things, important things. Like, how do we eliminate malaria? By controlling the mosquitoes that actually are the vectors for malaria. So if we are spraying our marshes with DDT and we kill the mosquitoes, it'll cut down the malaria. And in fact, it did. It did incredibly brilliantly. If you have crops, let's say you've got a fruit farm, you've got apples or something like that, and you've got all of these worms and other insect things that are attacking your crop, you spray it with DDT, it kills those, man, it would be great. The only problem with DDT, however, is that DDT is not what we would call biodegradable. It's the gift that keeps on giving. You apply it in nature, it evaporates with the water, it gets rained and snowed down in other places. By the way, there is DDT in the ice in Antarctica. I don't think they have a big bug problem down there. It's got there with global circulation patterns. And the other thing is it's fat soluble and your body cannot break it down. So if you get DDT in your body, you can't break it down, so what your body does is it stores it in fat. it sort of gets it out of the way. You store it someplace, put it in the attic, put it in the basement, just get it out of the bloodstream. So that's what it does. The problem of DDT is that it mimics hormones. And so what we found in birds, and by the way, these are just some of the advertisements that used to go on this in the 40s and 50s. DDT is good for me. Yeah, so the Killing Salts Chemical Company. And you were encouraged to use it in your house. You could use it for pesky bugs. I grew up in Shaker Heights, and I remember going out, we'd be playing baseball in the front yard of the house, and then you'd hear this loud droning motor coming down the street. And you'd see this truck, and it was broadcasting this fine white mist. And we thought it was kind of cool. We'd be sitting there, and you'd feel the mist landing on your skin. And then you'd watch the robins drop dead out of the trees around you. That was DDT, and they were spraying the American elms to try and protect them from Dutch elm disease. That's how universally we used it. And what happened is it started accumulating in the environment. Now, if you have small amounts of DDT in the water, the trouble is because it's fat soluble, all the little one-celled organisms pick it up into their bodies, they can't get rid of it. They get consumed by bigger organisms, they can't get rid of it. And as you go up the food chain, you see how the concentration increases. And if you get parts per billion or parts per million in a bird of prey, what it does is when the female eagle, in this case, wants to lay an egg, now she's got to create in that egg all the ingredients to cook up one baby bird. In other words, nothing else gets added. As a matter of fact, an egg, this is very counterintuitive, over the course of the 35 days that a mother and father eagle incubate the egg loses weight. And you might say, well, wait a minute. How can it lose weight? Because there's a baby growing in there. But remember, the ingredient list is finite. And the way it's losing weight is it's losing water vapor through pores in the shell. And so it actually loses about 15% of its weight. So the female eagle does amazing things. And it's not just an eagle. A chicken does this, a duck, a goose. Whenever that female is calling on calcium from her skeleton, she's calling on resources from her fat to be able to assemble all the things that she needs to have in that egg. Now, the problem is that as you're mobilizing the fat, you're mobilizing up all that stored DDT. And the DDT starts interrupting the estrogen cycling in the body, and it interferes with her body to take the calcium and lay it down the eggshell, and she lays a thin-shelled egg. And we know by comparing eggs after World War II with eggs in museum collections from before that we were starting to see 10, 15, 20, 25% thinning. With peregrine falcons, they would actually sometimes see eggs that were shellless. The female couldn't put any calcium on. Either way, you don't have the next generation. You have a whole generation of eagles that are trying to reproduce, and they can't produce any youngsters. And the notion is that you spray a field if you try and protect your crops, and you get a rain, and just like we see it with fertilizer going into the Maumee River and boosting phosphorus levels in Lake Erie. You can see the mechanism of how this stuff gets around. And DDT, we think, was primarily responsible for this incredibly precipitous decline of eagles from 1945 to the 1970s. And that's one of the things that led to its being banned. When they created the EPA, one of the first things they did was ban DDT. The problem with DDT, in retrospect, is that knowing the characteristics of it, if we had used it 1 year and then not used it for a bunch of years, the idea is that if you use it 1 year, it's going to kill all the bugs, except if any bugs survive, what could you infer about those bugs? They have an innate immunity to DDT. And guess what? They're giving rise to the next generation. So over the course of time, the manufacturers of DDT were saying, use more, use more, use more. And what was happening is that nature was forming a response. And all of these pests were becoming resistant to it. And you had all these non-target animals like eagles that were suffering. So it really mucked it up. There's some suggestion that in this day and age, if we had DDT impregnated mosquito netting, it's used in the tropics to prevent mosquitoes from getting to people when they're sleeping at night, that would be an incredibly useful application of it. just don't spray it willy-nilly in the environment where it can continue to cycle and reinfect things. It's got a half-life that's the better part of, I think, 30 years. So it is a really long-lived chemical. The great thing is, with the banning in the early 70s, is basically the environment is cleaned up dramatically. So, it said in 1979 we had 4 active nests in the state of Ohio. This is Sandusky Bay, there's Cedar Point Park, which we probably all know, Kelly's Island, where the museum has some nature preserves, these vast wetlands over here, that Winus Point place on the coast there. We had one at Whiteman's Grove, we had one near Rest Haven, we had one at Toussaint Marsh, and one up at Little Cedar Creek, part of the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And these nests were not producing any youngsters. So this was the crisis. We were literally about to lose bald eagles in Ohio. The adults were not having any luck bringing off any youngsters. As they get older, now eagles can live a long time, but you know, stuff happens. You get older and you get infirm, you can't find food, and ultimately, you know, your numbers wither. And again, just to reaffirm that picture that I showed you from Herrick with the nest right over the farmer's field, well, here's the Toussaint nest, and here's the farmer's field right there. There's the eagle nest. I remember watching the eagles actually strafing the ground where there was old corn stalks and using that to incorporate in their nest while the farmer was plowing the field on the other side of the field. So they were incredibly tolerant of human activity. So the conditions were right for the return of bald eagles in that by the 1970s you banned DDT. You now have rigorous enforcement of the law. Something called the Endangered Species Act was passed, which even doubles down on the penalties that can be applied to someone who kills or harms a bald eagle. So that's when we got into trying to help out at the Natural History Museum. So this is what the Museum of Natural History looks like now. In 1972, we thought, you know, if we could get some eagles, and we could get them to breed in captivity, we could figure out, even if they had thin-shelled eggs, maybe we could, you know, hatch them in an incubator where we could treat them more gingerly than the parents could, and maybe we could do something about producing eggs or chicks that then we could put out in the wild nests of Ohio. We thought this was a great idea. So we had a good friend at the museum, James Ireland. He gave us money to build this big aviary along the east flank of the museum. And then we petitioned the United States government to get us some birds. And they responded by getting us George and Martha. Now, Martha was a female eagle, and she originally had collided with high tension wires in Indiana. And she apparently was like recently fledged from a nest there, had a bum wing, and she was kept at this game refuge. And any of you who've ever gone searching for the sandhill cranes at Jasper, Pulaski State Wildlife in Indiana, that's where she was housed. And then George was a bird that was shot in Illinois, and couldn't be returned to the wild. So we petitioned for these 2 birds, and the government came through with them, and so we had this big cage. And so we put them together. And the only problem was, as we put them together, all they would ever do was fight. And if you were George, this is what you'd see coming at you. Martha, talons flashing. And the fighting was not very pleasant. As a matter of fact, one December day, I remember going into the enclosure, and it had snowed, and I was looking at Martha, and she's standing in the snow at the bottom of the cage, and I'm looking around for George, and he's not George. And I looked down, and underneath her, there's this ominous red stain in the snow. That was George. She had knocked him down, rode him down to the ground, and she was plucking the feathers out of his head, creating a truly bald eagle. By the way, point of explanation. You think bald, wait a minute, they've got feathers, they're not bald. Remember that a couple hundred years ago, the word bald meant white. And the original name of this bird is called the bald-headed eagle, or white-headed eagle. Now it refers to this condition. Anyway, so the fighting was so bad, we finally separated. So we had George in a cage behind the museum, and we had Martha up here. This is a young fellow by the name of Carl Lutzman. Carl was a high schooler, and he had unfortunately been diagnosed with a brain tumor. He had surgery for it. Then he had radiation therapy, caused him to lose his hair, and he took to wearing this kind of sailor's hat with the brim down. And whether that has anything to do with what comes next, Martha ended up the following spring laying eggs. And apparently in response to Carl. Now these were infertile eggs, they're never going to hatch. They're duds, but she is now one of the only egg-laying bald eagles in captivity anywhere in the world. And she seems to be doing this in response to Carl. So remember, Carl would walk up to the nest, he'd pick up a stick. Martha would fly down, gently take the stick out of his hand, and fly up and put it in the nest bowl. So she seemed to have taken Carl on as her mate. So we thought, cool, we've got George. Now, when I was at Cornell, the folks at the Peregrine Fund and the World Center for Birds of Prey were very, very successful in finding different ways of breeding bald eagles, using artificial insemination for one. And I won't go into all the details because of the nature of our audience here today, but just suffice it to say is that it would be possible for us to be the middleman in the exchange of reproductive bodies and still get viable eggs. So, we went to George. And every day we'd go out and we'd grab George and we'd do these things they do to turkeys, and every day, no. And this went on for about a week until George responded by laying an egg. So, we had egg on our face for that one. So how could we make such a stupid blunder as to mix George up with Georgette? Well, a couple of things. First of all, a male and a female eagle look exactly the same. You can't lift up the tail and look underneath and figure out if it's a boy or girl. If, in fact, you go to a place, go to some of your parks here, your Geauga parks, and you do see breeding eagles, if you see a male and female side by side, the female is about 15 to 20% bigger. So you can tell if you've got another bird for contrast. Complicating things here, though, is George, or Georgette, even though she was just the right size and weight for a Great Lakes male, turns out that eagles down in Florida are much smaller, and sometimes those eagles in the summertime will drift up to the Great Lakes and then head on down, and they don't nest until November down in Florida. So clearly Georgette was a southern female that happened to be in Illinois when she was shot. And I gotta say, just in my defense, the other reason why we assumed they were male and female is the United States government told me. Anyway, after that boondoggle, unfortunately we were vandalized at the museum and poor Georgette was killed. And the photo that I showed you of the dead eagle on the persecution slide, that actually was George. People came in, they didn't take anything, they brought two guys and a dog and just clubbed a bunch of birds we had. So anyway, after that we consolidated our collection, we put a lot of money into a big security system. We were bound and determined that we wanted to be able to breed these. We wanted to help Ohio's eagles. We also felt it was really important to do it in the city of Cleveland, so that people could come and they could see Martha on display, and they could see conservation in action. They could see what we were trying to do. So we finally got some other birds, including Argus here, and here's Carl, much older, with a full beard and a different kind of cap. And here's Argus with a hood, a falconer-style hood on. And we were actually successful in learning how to breed bald eagles by artificial insemination. That's me looking at stuff under a microscope. And this is Carl whispering sweet nothings to Martha. One of the ways you know how relaxed she is for a bird of prey is a lot of times birds of prey, if they're not happy, they put their hackles up. You're going to see that when I bring Meep out later. He's not an eagle, he's a red-tailed hawk. But when he'll have his neck and the feathers between his wings up, and that is an incredibly aggressive posture. But if you've got the feathers of your throat, your gular feathers inflated here, that's a bird that's very calm and very relaxed. So you can tell that Martha is really relaxed here. And so Carl would have those reproductive products in a little trabecular syringe, and then he's actually petting her here. She's looking this way. She would take her tail, flip it off the side, evert her oviduct into the entrance to the cloaca. He touched the little syringe there, bingo, job's done. And then any eggs that were laid after that would have the potential of being fertile. So what we would oftentimes do is I got to show you this picture. Whenever an eagle, and sometimes you can see this if you watch the Decara eagles on Iowa or the Eagles in southern Pennsylvania. There's a couple fabulous webcams, Eagle cams, or the Eagles at Berry College. You can sometimes see the adults. The male was taken over the Pennsylvania nest last week, and you can see how they walk up to the eggs, and then they come down on their tarsi, this part above the what seems like their ankle, and then they waddle up to the eggs, careful that these talons, which are an inch to an inch and a half long and could pierce anything, careful that they do not harm the eggs. And then they get up in front of they're over the eggs, they fluff out all the feathers on their belly, then they go forward and then they come down like this to roll the eggs up under their feathers so the eggs are actually in contact with the skin. And particularly on the female, she develops a brood patch where the skin here becomes very kind of loose, highly vascularized. That means it's got a very rich blood supply, so that it maximizes the surface area that the eggs actually contact her skin, because that's how she's delivering the heat. And again, they keep those eggs around 99.5 degrees for 35 days. And there was, again, that webcam from southern, that the DNR in Pennsylvania runs. They had that snowstorm from a couple weeks ago, and you can see in this one picture, all you see are the eyes and the beak above this whole layer of snow. I mean, there's probably a good, maybe 8-10 inches of snow covering the eagle, the nest, and everything. Rest assured that underneath there, because those eggs hatched out last week, that those eggs were being kept at 99.5 degrees. Very, very interesting. So, and here's, Martha was a pretty good incubator. She would incubate in the snow. You can see Carl talking to her there. Or in the heat, and you can see that's the tongue. And when they're panting, they open up their beak and they kind of thrust the tongue out as they pant to cool off. But we would oftentimes take the eggs. And we would take the eggs and put them in an incubator. And then the idea was, if we took the eggs, Martha would lay more eggs. And at the time, we were trying to maximize our production because, again, the goal was to either have fertile eggs or nestlings that we could farm out, give to the Ohio Division of Wildlife to place in wild nests in the state of Ohio. So this is what a hatchable bald eagle looks like. So a baby bird is an unbelievable contortionist. In that shell, and you'll see how big the bird is when it comes out, they're all twisted around like this, but at the end, the tip of their beak, they've got something called an egg tooth. It's like a little bony spur. And what they do is they're entirely encapsulated in this membrane. But there's this little thing called an air cell at one end of the shell. So when it's coming time to hatch it, what they do is they use that little spur and they break into the air cell. Now they can put their beak in there, and for the first time in their life they can breathe. Because up to this point, they have an umbilicus like this. The blood vessels would come out and circulate blood in a membrane around them, and they were actually getting oxygen and getting rid of water vapor and carbon dioxide through microscopic pores in the shell. It's exactly the same as a turkey or a chicken or any other bird. So you get first into that air cell. Now you can breathe, and you can hear them peeping inside. And then what you do is you take a break. Now that break might be as long as 24 hours. And what you're doing in the break is you're retrieving all of the blood from the shell membrane in your, well actually what you do first then is you create a hole or a pit. So once you got the hole here, now you can actually breathe air. So before you're just breathing what's in the air cell, now you're actually broken through to the outside. Now you can start breathing. Once that starts happening, you have your quiet time as you draw all the blood back into your body, and then the muscles of that umbilicus close down. And then when that's done, you start picking with that little egg tooth on the inside of the shell. You generally go, this is the pointed end here, you go counterclockwise. They have a huge muscle on the back of their neck that's there almost only for hatching. And they pick, and then they're pushing, like that. And when they get about 2/3 of the way around, that entire cap will flex off, and then the baby eagle pops out. And that's what the national bird looks like on its hatch day. 3.5 ounces of fury. You can see, by the way, the eyelid is here, but look at how big the eye is. That whole thing is eye. Here's the cere, the fleshy part of the beak. There's the beak. You can see there's one of its feet. You can see the umbilicus right here and a little bit of blood left from those vessels coming in. So really kind of analogous to us mammals. An umbilical cord only, the umbilical cord you're plugged into your mom. This is the yolk supply also would have been outside the body, and what's left of the yolk supply is drawn into the body also at this time. Now, this is what they look like about 10 hours later. Because this looks like a baby dinosaur. This looks really adorable. You can see the egg tooth is right there. And so these guys are not totally helpless, let's say like a baby robin is. So 10 hours after they've hatched, their feathers are dried out. Now, well, they'll start begging for food, and the mom will have a fish or something, and she'll tear off a piece, and she'll hang it over their head. They have to, however, reach up. They've got to see it reach up and grab it. So it's not like a robin that just opens its mouth, and then the mom plunges the stuff inside the mouth. Have you ever seen a baby robin? And they have those yellow, fleshy, almost like lips. You wonder why they have them? Well, if you ever open their beaks and you look down at them, it's this beautiful yellow circle target. It's kind of like for mom. Okay, coming in now, we're docking mechanism. But these guys are different. They, these babies have to be able to reach up and grab the food. So that was our job. And these pictures are, by the way, from the 1980s and 90s. We had our first success in 1983, well, our first fertile egg in 83, our first successful hatch in 84, and we did this until 1999. And then at that point, nobody is allowed to breed bald eagles anymore. We have robust numbers, their numbers have come back, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't want us breeding them in captivity, ones that would stay in captivity. And then you feed them, oh, it's a great diet. It's so fun. You get to grind up chickens and fish and mice, and then grind them all up in little pieces and these trees. Now we would use a puppet. And the idea behind the puppet is I wouldn't hide from the bird. I would be holding the puppet like this and using the forceps. But we wanted the chicks to start getting oriented to a yellow-orange beak on the end of a white head. Because these guys were bound for wild nests. They weren't going to stay with me. We had them for about 3 weeks. And we think that, if you take a baby duck, and on the day it hatches, if the only large moving thing it sees is you, it will imprint on you and you become mom. And then when it becomes an adult, it will look to something that looks like you to become a reproductive partner or a social partner. That's called imprinting. Now, birds that are helpless in the nest or semi-helpless, that imprinting doesn't take place till much later on in the nesting phase. Bald eagle is in the nest for about 10 to 12 weeks before it finally leaves. About when it's 4 to 5 weeks old, it's having a hard, long look at what's bringing its food. And it's forming its own sense of self-identity by what its parents look like. So we knew as long as these guys were placed early, they weren't going to imprint on us. But we did want them orienting to a yellow beak. So we would use this and we'd feed them, generally offer them about 10% of their body weight at each feeding, and they would have a net increase in body weight of 20% every day. So every 5th day, they're doubling their weight. Now, Clyde Simpson, our astronomer at the museum, did those calculations and said, if the bird did that for the entire 12 weeks of its nestling period, it would be the size of a blue whale. So this only happens for about the first week and a half, but it's an incredibly fast. I don't know many things that grow faster than that because they've got to do that. They're in a race against the calendar. They've got to get full-size flighted and get out of that nest and learn how to hunt, and that allows to take place before fall when the parents cut them loose. Because if you don't know how to take care of yourself then, or you can't fly well enough then you're not going to survive. This is what they look like when they're sleeping. Now, I got to tell you, the first bald eagle we hatched, that was the first bald eagle, baby bald eagle I'd ever seen. I spent a lot of time with lots of other birds of prey, and when they first started doing this, I went, it's dying! And they like to have their head, and sometimes you'll see this on a nest, you'll see their head just draped over sticks. There were some years we had multiple youngsters, including this year when we had 3. And then we were using, instead of putting them in a brooder with the brooders all the same temperature, we'd actually put them in these containers where underneath here is these K-pads that circulate warm water at body temperature. And then if the bird's cold, it can sit on that, like it just can get up to the belly of the mom. Or if it's hot, it can get off in the corner. So the chick actually selects where it's most comfortable. We're not imposing something on it. And they grow quick. Oftentimes, if we only had singles, we'd give them a mirror so they got used to seeing their reflection, because they would have to be able to cope with a sibling, or a foster sibling, once they got put in that nest. And this was the last trio we had. This was 1999. You can see this was the first one hatched. By the way, they've just been fed, and that's its crop. That's a sack off its stomach. So if you're a bird of prey, you literally can't have eyes bigger than your stomach, because once your stomach's full, you continue eating, and then this crop just keeps filling up here, and it's this swelling that you'll see at the base of the throat. And then as the stomach empties, the crop will push the food down into the stomach. This guy we call Rocket, but he had developed a coliform infection, and he never lost any weight. But for 4 days, he was fighting the infection. So he lost 4 days of growth versus his siblings. And you can see, again, just how rapidly they grow. Okay, then we would, all the time that we're doing this, we're in touch with the Ohio Division of Wildlife. And we're saying, okay, guys, we have these chicks that are of this age. You have nests for us. And they'd be monitoring all the nests in Ohio. And so they would know if there was a nest that where the eggs had failed, or a nest that has a chick. It would be about the same age as one of our chicks, that we could add a chick to it. And so then they would go to the nest. As you approach the nest, the adult flies off the nest. You know what? They're very protective of the nest, but they don't attack. So they'd be circling around and cackling and scolding the people that are going there. This is actually Dennis Case, who used to be the non-game biologist in the state of Ohio, and he was a climber, so he'd climb up this tree. This one happens to be very close to the airport in Sandusky, and the nest is up there. And then, meanwhile, we'd have the chick or chicks in a bag, and in that bag also would be a fish. And if they were old enough, we would ban them, or if not, the Ohio Division of Wildlife would come back 3 or 4 weeks later when the legs are full size, and they put the bands on. And then these chicks go on a ride of their life as they get hoisted up into that nest tree, and then they get plopped into that nest, sometimes with a brand new brother or sister who they've never met before. And then Dennis would leave the fish between them, and then he'd skedaddle. Oftentimes the last thing he'd do is put a few moth crystals around the base, or mothballs around the base of the tree. Why? Because raccoons, smart animals as they are, oftentimes follow human trails. Because why? We throw a lot of food away, a lot of garbage. So we didn't want raccoons following the trail of the bander right up to the nest. Now, a bald eagle could make a pretty good defense against a raccoon, but a raccoon's a significant predator of eggs and baby birds. So the moth crystals were just to throw them off the scent. And we'd skedaddle there, and then Mom would come back to the nest. And then you'd be sitting there, we'd be a couple hundred yards away looking through scopes, and you'd be holding your, crossing your fingers and just hoping. We never had a bird rejected. And what would happen, in my mind, it's like, Mom leaves the nest. She had one kid. She comes back to the nest, now there's a second kid and a fish. She's got to know something's up. But as long as both of the chicks begged for food, her instinct is to feed them. And by the way, there's a fish that she can tear up to feed them. And once you saw the feeding behavior, you knew that the adoption was complete. So it was a very elegant way to make sure that Ohio's bald eagles continued to have young. In other states, they tried to bring in birds and release them from towers and things like they did with osprey here in Ohio. But, we had 4 active nests, and it was really imperative to make sure that our nests produced, because those adults were Ohio eagles. They were birds that were used to people or some human interactions. They could cope with human activity, and that they would be the best parents for the next generation. Now, I told you there was only 4 active nests in 1979. The Division of Wildlife has stopped counting. They stopped counting officially in 2009, but even then they were up to 215. We think that we're well north of 300, 350 nests in the state of Ohio now. And it's getting to the point where I won't say that the eagles are getting to be a dime a dozen, because in my view, never be a dime a dozen. But you can see them almost anywhere. I see them along the mouth of the Cuyahoga River in downtown Cleveland, and we think that they're nesting up a little bit upriver from the ArcelorMittal steel plant. If you happen to be a Lake County resident, there's a bald eagle nest between Chillicothe Road and Interstate 90 on a horse farm. There's no water nearby, but these birds seem to be doing it. She's incubating there. If you go up to Mentor Marsh, which is a state nature preserve, and also the land actually happens to be owned by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. We currently have 7,000 acres of land, some in Geauga County, but mostly in Ashtabula, and actually from Kelly's Island to the Pennsylvania border, all the way down to the Singer Lake Bog by the Akron-Canton International Airport. We now have a collection of nature preserves that we intend to maintain in perpetuity, so that the prime directive there is to preserve nature. Some of them are available to the public, like Mentor Marsh, North Kingsville Sand Barrens. Others are so fragile that we limit it to like 25 people a year, because we know a floating mat of a bog that you actually can damage that if you have more people there. So Jim Bissell, who spoke to you guys a couple weeks ago, is very, very careful to try and come up with a management plan that suits each habitat, not have a one-size-fits-all. And this is also from 2009 rather, and this is actually off because there's lots of eagles all through here now. And this is the population of eagles nationwide. This has been a great conservation success story. It started with rigorous protection under the laws, using the wildlife laws, the Bald Eagle Act, Endangered Species Act. This is exactly the way the Endangered Species Act was meant to be. If an animal needs help, throw it in the Endangered Species Act. You do what you can to conserve it and restore it. Once it's restored, what do? You take it off the Endangered Species list, because the Endangered Species Act has done what it was supposed to do. And now the bald eagle is no longer an endangered or even a threat species. It's just a bird that is having an incredible renaissance. And these birds are not your great-grandfather or great-grandmother's bald eagles. They are much more adaptable and much more capable of living alongside us. So now you can see gatherings of them. Some folks were birding in Conneaut, Ohio last summer, and in July, on the breakwall in the Conneaut Harbor, I think one day they counted 57. Now those were not white-headed adults, those were 1 and 2 years old, and there was probably things happening in the lake in terms of available fish, and they were going out there. But it really is cool. Here's a nice illustration here of an adult and then a juvenile. So there are still issues, though. Occasionally you'll see birds that strike high tension wires. This is Mark Shieldcastle, the bird here. So we still see, not so much in Ohio, but in other states, lead poisoning is an issue. Remember that eagles will sometimes scavenge. So if you had a deer carcass where there was a lead slug, and if the eagle, again, you can be shot with a lead pellet, and if it doesn't damage you, it embeds in your muscles, your body builds a cyst around it, that's it. It doesn't have any other reaction to you. You can live your life out with it there. But if you consume it, your stomach acids free up enough of the lead to be absorbed in your bloodstream, and then you get lead poisoning. So lead poisoning is still an issue. One of the biggest threats to California condors, one of the most endangered birds on the planet, that's been successfully reintroduced into both California, Oregon, and Arizona, is they scavenge animals that were shot and they eat the lead. And it's a huge problem. Now, I'm not saying that everyone's going to have bald eagles in their backyard on their trampoline, but the bald eagle is back. And this is really, really heartening, because it reminds us, that our cities grow, urban sprawl. I mean, you just see the impact of humans is everywhere. But this story shows us if we value something, that we can turn things around for an animal like this. We can bring it back. This ended up being a flagship species. A lot of wetland habitat was preserved and restored because of bald eagles. Because of the bald eagle, rigorous enforcement of the laws that we have on the books. You don't need any other new laws, you just have to enforce the laws that you've got. The idea to be careful and mindful of what we put in the environment. You know, the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act have made a difference to Baldy by limiting these toxins that we put in the environment. And also remember that these guys are a barometer of the quality of our environment. And when we see some of these animals, particularly something as iconic as a bald eagle, when we see them suffering, diminishing, waning away, we better take a hard, long look at the environment. Because it's not the eagle's environment, it's our environment. There's only one environment. We breathe the same air, we drink the same water, we're part of the same system. So we need to be mindful of that, and be mindful of nature. So, with that, that's the legacy, mark of the bald eagle. That's the story of the bald eagle. I would bring a live bird. So, at the Museum of Natural History, we have something that Ed was talking about, the Perkins Wildlife Center in Woods Garden. It's a zoo of native wildlife. Unlike zoos, we don't do the wildlife rehabilitation anymore at the museum, but we are a destination for animals that cannot be returned to the wild. So I do a lot of business with Lake Erie Nature and Science Center, with Lake Metro Parks, with Medina Raptor Center, Back to the Wild. If they've got an animal, it's got a permanent injury, it's too tame, dependent, it can't be returned back to the wild, then I'm one of the people they contact to find out if we have space and if we can fit it into our program. So our intention at the museum and the Wildlife Center is to introduce folks to the animals that share this part of the world with us. I mean, I love going to the zoo. I love seeing giraffes, I love seeing lion and tiger and bear, oh my. And it's important, but you know, it's really important that we have a relationship and we understand the things that live around here. I'll tell you this little story, then I'll bring Bert up. We had our gray fox. The gray fox is a little smaller than the red fox you typically see around here, but it is indigenous to Geauga County. Black tip to the tail. Cool critter. They're one of the only tree climbing members of the dog family. They actually can scamper, not up a vertical tree, but a tree on an angle. And we had this guy's name was Spalding. He's the coolest thing in the world. He'd go and scratch his eyes. But he unfortunately developed a tumor, and the tumor was inoperable, and at age 10 and a half, he passed away. So I was looking to get another gray fox. So there's something called the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council. They have an animal placement service. So these rehab centers, if they've got an animal that they're looking for a home for, they list the animals there. So I see that this lady up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, has got a gray fox. And so I call her, Sharon, tell me about the fox. Oh, Hart, these folks were burning this field, trying to get rid of this woody vegetation. And as the fire line raced across the field, they heard squeals. They went to take a closer look, and there were these two tiny little gray fox kids. They were both burned. The male did not survive, but the female's, I think, is going to be okay, but we have to hand raise her. So she's going to be too tame. We can't let her go. Do you want her? I said, yeah, this is going to be great. So why don't you keep her until she's weaned and gets her first round of shots, then I'll come up to Michigan and get her. So 3 weeks before I'm supposed to go up there, I get a phone call. Harvey, this is Sharon. Oh, no, Sharon, did something happen to the gray fox? No, she's fine. She's playing on my feet right now, but she's no longer a gray fox. That was my reaction. What? What are you talking about? What is she? Well, she's a coyote. Okay. So, do you still want her? And I said, no. I think we can work it out that we have an enclosure that is it's not perfect, but it will work. And yeah, if you can't let it go, we'll take it. So we got charcoal coyote. And, you know, so a lot of people, a coyote is varmint. A lot of people are scared silly when they see a coyote. A lot of people think that a coyote is an incredible threat to your dogs and cats. There might be some truth to any of those things. But the biggest thing that we all ought to be is smart about coyotes. Because guess what? They're here and they ain't going anywhere. We didn't put them here. They moved into the state all by themselves. They're in all 88 counties. They're in your neighborhood. If you have a small dog and you let it out at night, you're playing with fire. You know, if you have a cat that you let outside, I'm just going to betray my personal bias here. We think that cats not feral barnyard cats, but house cats allowed to go outside, kill 4.5 million songbirds a day. Some people think that it is the largest source of non-traditional mortality that you find in nature. I think your kitties ought to be inside. Anyway, whether coyotes actually kill that many cats, I don't know. But if you're smart about them, I'm aware of one coyote attack in the state of Ohio. It was at North Chagrin Reservation, and it was a rabid animal. Now, a rabid anything might attack you. I'm not going to blame an entire species for that. There's a lot of good that coyotes do by having another medium-sized predator. They're not having the effect on the deer population maybe we would like, because they typically will not pack, not our Ohio coyotes. Coyotes in the eastern part of the United States do. But if you ever get a chance to come to the museum and you take a look at Charcoal, and you see her in there with Michelle Leidy Jones, my manager of the Perkins Wildlife Center, and she's playing like a little puppy dog, you think, that's no different than the dog that I've got back home. But she's incredibly smart, really intuitive. Every day I get more and more respect for this animal, just having the opportunity to interact with it. Now that doesn't mean we're all going to give a coyote a hug. Doesn't mean that all the coyotes can't do damage. But it has to do with being informed and educated about what's out your back door. Because Mother Nature's all around us. Okay? So anyway, that's our intent, is to be able to have this selection of animals, from bobcat to river otters, bald eagles, peregrine falcons. Many of them are conservation success stories. Many of them remind us that there is a natural or a wild side to Ohio, to our own neighborhoods and communities. And I think that's exhilarating. So I'm going to show you Meep. Meep is an adult red-tailed hawk. I gather his picture was in the paper today. And I'll tell you his story. Now, I tell you what, guys, you folks up front, I'm standing on a tarp. Why do I have a tarp? Because he might go. If he goes, just a point of clarification, when the tail goes up and the belly feathers go down, they don't drop this stuff. They forcibly eject it from his body. So, I think you're safe. That's why I'm on this corner of the tarp. Okay. Now, this is embarrassing. Will you stop doing that, please? So, let me tell you about Meep. Meep hatched at the Natural History Museum. We had a male and a female hawk. But we only had them together in a cage for a day. And I figured, what kind of trouble can they get into? So, a couple days later, we looked at his female's cage, and there's an egg. And there's another egg. We thought, well, it can't be that they're fertile. But we put them in one of these fancy incubators, and a month later, out hatches these two baby red-tailed hawks. Now, our permit with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was not to propagate red-tailed hawks. So I contacted the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and said, I'm bad. What do we do? They said, okay, well, Back to the Wild has got a female red-tailed hawk that acts as a surrogate parent. Could you take the chicks there, and then maybe the surrogate parent can raise them? They'll be raised by a red-tailed hawk, and they can be released back to the wild. Great idea. So we took the birds up, gave them to Mona Rucker Back to the Wild. And unfortunately, something happened with the surrogate mother, and Mona ended up hand-raising the two youngsters. And they became imprinted on human beings. Remember I told you that duckling story? So I won't tell you, because it's a diverse audience, what he was just doing on my glove, but just let's say he's really friendly with the glove. In his mind, he thinks he's human. He is bonded to humans. So he and I are big-time buddies. And this is a permanent, lifelong situation. You will not grow out of it. And he's kind of curious because he was raised by a woman, and yet he ends up being very aggressive to my female staff, and he's really friendly to the male staff. Anyway, this is the red-tailed hawk. Now, I call it hawk. I can do this without putting anybody in the danger. Because he's got that rusty brown tail. He's got a little white terminal band and a little black subterminal band there. That's a tough field mark because oftentimes when you see them, they're soaring in the sky overhead. And unless they bank and you see the sun reflecting off the top of the tail, it doesn't, you're looking at the underside, which is kind of a silvery gray. But that red-tailed hawk, the red-tail's diagnostic, and then they've got these big, broad wings. And so these are the wind masters, I like to say. They are soaring hawks. And you might notice that the wingtips are slotted. They almost look like fingertips when they stretch their wings out. And that's an adaptation to allow soaring or gliding flight. So what they do is they get up in the sky and they find a place over maybe a parking lot, a field, some place that's going to heat up fast in the morning relative to the forests around it. And as the air warms up, it rises. And so what birds of prey like eagles and red-tailed hawks do, okay, well, don't act surprised. As we say, it happens. So, now we're going to look at it. Now we got that over with. You know, you cannot house train a bird. They don't have a bladder. There's no place to store it. So when you got to go. Okay. Anyways, back to these guys. So they get up in the sky and they find these places where the air rises up off the ground. They spread those mighty wings out. And then they can just ride the air current. And they ride the air current up and they get higher and higher and higher. And then they can glide down in the direction that they want to go. And if they get the right kind of favorable conditions, they can spend all day long flying. And since they're not flapping their wings, they're hardly putting any energy into it. They're using these remarkable eyes to spot little animals moving in the ground beneath them. Someone suggested that if this guy could read, he could hold up a newspaper, the classified section, the fine print, 100 yards away from it, the other end of a football field. And he could read it. Though actually the eye is designed to spot movement. And they also have in each eye two fovea. So the fovea is the part of our eye in your retina that gives you the best vision, the densest concentration of visual cells. And an image, when you're looking straight ahead, the image is falling on the fovea in each eye. They've got two fovea that face forward. They also have a fovea that faces this way in the right eye, and one that faces that way. And I like to say that it's almost like looking three places at the same time. Because even though they might not get the depth perception that if something moves over there, they'll see it. And then they can turn their head and look in that direction. So just remarkable eyesight. We don't know much about their sense of smell, but birds of prey are not known. Birds in general are not known much for a sense of smell. I mean, great horned owls eat skunks. So no accounting for taste. So it is incredible hearing, but spectacular eyesight. And that's pretty much what's important for them. They have on their feet scales, as part of their dinosaur background. And you can see these immense talons. I'm not wearing the glove because he's got cold feet. Because those talons that go right into my skin, they can bring a couple 100 pounds of pressure per square inch. At the tip of each talon, you have 4 talons in each toe. Each foot, they all come to a single point, and you don't want to be the single point. All of the architecture of the foot is for grabbing something and not letting go. Typical food for red-tailed hawk are mice, any kind of mice. Meadow mice out in the field, house mice, deer mice, whatever kind of mouse you can get. Any kind of rat, squirrel, chipmunks, pretty much anything in the rodent. They would go after a small groundhog. An adult groundhog would be pretty tough on them. Rabbits. They like rabbits. They'll go after snakes. They might go after something small like an opossum, but generally things like opossums are not active during the daytime where they can get them. So they're very handy and useful to have in the environment. The other thing about them is they like grassland areas with big shade trees nearby. What habitat do we have that matches that description? The interstate highway system. You get these median strips of grass, you get grassy shoulders, and usually have mature trees. Some people call the red-tailed hawk the freeway hawk because of how frequently we see them along the interstate highway. We also have them nesting in the city. We see them out by the Museum of Natural History hunting squirrels all the time. So it's a really, really cool bird. If you ever want to see them, you've got to do something, though. This is very important. I hope all you guys remember this. If you want to see a red-tailed hawk in nature, you know what you have to do? You have to look up. Because most of the time they're going to be soaring in the sky above you. Now, you might say, well, of course you have to do that. Well, wait a minute. How many times a day do you actually look up? There's a world of feathered things that are flying around us that we ignore. I mean, we were driving the other day, and there was one of these huge flocks, mixed flocks of blackbirds. And there was probably 2,000 or 3,000 birds in it. You know, and they're going across the freeway. Like, wow, that's a lot of birds. How many people actually pick up on it? I use this illustration. Once I was pumping gas at what is now a speedway at 306 Interstate 90. And it was before they had the canopy on top of the entire gas station. It was a marathon back then. And I'm sitting there, I'm pumping the gas and looking around, and I hear this. And I look up, and there's a broad V of over 300 thunder swans headed north on 306, not at very great altitude. And I'm just going, and boy, it was a dark sky. It was one of those sights that just, you know, you go all goose pimply and everything. And I'm looking at that, and they go off in the distance. I look around, and not one person of the 30 people at that gas station looked up. Not one! So I exhort you all, when you're outside, look up from time to time, because you know, particularly here in Geauga County, you've got so many riches, so many natural riches, and just keep your senses open for them. Anyway, this guy was hatched in 2001, so he's 14 years old this year. I had a red-tailed hawk once live to be 32, so they're capable of really long lives. I hope he lives that long. He's a great bird, and he's a great agent for education because he's so calm with people. You know, he's very comfortable on the glove. Actually, you saw he was way too comfortable. But that way we can bring him into an environment like this, and we don't worry about stressing him out, and so you get a chance to see one of the coolest birds around here up close and personal. I thank you very much.